So thank you for this morning. That was fun.
Welcome back.
Thank you. And I wanted to talk about something for a couple minutes. Most of you have heard some version of this, but it's sort of like if you've ever heard India's story. She used to tell her story every year. It was so never the same. And it doesn't feel like I'm going to be saying this story, anymore. But it's significant to what we're doing, I think. So, for example, like what I'm talking about, what I'm learning about, and it really does feel like this is what I'm learning about, is freedom yoga. Teaching it helps me learn about it. You teach what you need to learn. That's sure been the case for me. And again, if you are ever put in the position of being a teacher, don't feel like you've got to have it all figured out before you're worthy. Just share what you do know. The doing of that will push you deeper and deeper and deeper, and sort of like force you to get clearer. So that's fun. It's not easy necessarily, but it's sort of like a good process. But for me, I haven't always done freedom yoga. I never heard of freedom yoga. And so I just sort of want to give my story a little bit. I'm sort of fearful that I wouldn't remember it. But can I do this for a sec? Do you mind?
Oh, please.
It's Carl's fault.
Good job.
Carl's my older brother. There's 4 boys in our family. Carl's number 1, I'm number 2. And there's 3 and 4. And when I was 10 or 12, Carl gave me a yoga book for my birthday. It was called Yoga, the Spirit. It was called The Spirit and Practice of Yoga, I think, by Michael Volin and Nancy Phelan. The Spirit and Practice of Yoga. When I wrote my book years later, sort of as a thank you to that book, I named mine Yoga. The publisher wanted yoga to be the first word of the title. The working title, as I was writing it, was Moving into Stillness. But the publisher thought that wasn't, we want yoga in the title. So the title became Yoga, the Spirit and Practice of Moving into Stillness. That's too long of a title for my liking, but that's the title. And it was in honor of that book that I got from Carl. I remember he gave me the book, I was 10 or 12, and I remember thinking, it was for my birthday, I remember thinking, what a stupid birthday present. A yoga book? Come on, a yoga book? And I just put it in a drawer and didn't even look at it. Until a couple of years later, I was cleaning out the drawer and I found the book. And it's like, oh yeah, there's that book that Carl gave me. And I finally flipped through it, and like it caught my attention at that point. And what I remember about it was something about the sheen on the man's skin. Looked cool. It was like luminous, or there was something different about it. And he was doing these strange poses. As I look at the book now, it's like there was nothing dramatic about the poses. It wasn't like an advanced asana book. But, there's the peacock and shoulder stand. Just shoulder stand seemed weird. And headstand, he's standing on his head. So something about these weird shapes and the sheen on the man's skin caught my attention, and the philosophy of the book is what I really liked. I started tinkering with the poses in the book. I was stiff, I was young, like I couldn't touch my toes, I couldn't do lotus. But I was trying. I was just sort of like copying the pictures in the book. And what I remember was this one afternoon, I was living at my parents' house still. I was in the back room, standing in the doorway. There's the hall, the doorway, and then my room. Used to be Carl's room, or whatever. It was my room. I was standing in the doorway and I was trying to do Uttanasana. Uttanasana is when you stand up, you fold forward, and you try and touch your nose to your knees. And I was nowhere close for a long time. And on this one day, I was getting closer and closer and closer, and I thought, yeah, I'm sort of close today. I think I'll just go for it. And so I was gentle, but I was a couple inches away, and I held my legs, I just pulled myself in, I touched my nose to my legs, and I started coming up again. And as I was coming up, I got this huge rush of something. And like from that moment where I touched my nose to my knees to a few seconds later when I was standing up, I was different. By the time I was standing up, my identity, my self-identity had changed. It's suddenly like, oh, I'm into yoga. Yoga's cool, I like yoga, I'm a yogi, And I just remember that moment of like, wow, suddenly, hey, I'm into this. I wasn't particularly interested in touching my toes or exercising, but it was fun. And somewhere around there, I started reading Krishnamurti books. My best friend gave me a Krishnamurti book, Think on These Things. And he said, and I just thought, wow, this is the best book I've ever read. And I read nothing but Krishnamurti for years, but he said, look, if you really want to understand what I'm saying, it really helps if you do yoga, meditate, and become a vegetarian. And so, okay, that's what I did. I started doing my yoga practice, trying to. I started meditating, trying to. And I became a vegetarian. Somewhere along there, I started reading every spiritual biography, every spiritual autobiography I could read. Again, it was like the spiritual stuff that was the most interesting, like Yogananda, and anyway, lots of books, any spiritual books I could get. There weren't any classes at that time where I was. There were no yoga studios where I was. I couldn't afford it anyway. You know what I mean? I was just a little kid living at home, getting into yoga. But so I was there at home trying to practice, and I was having fun. It was like I didn't know you needed a teacher or that it would be helpful. I was just like totally excited and learning all about this. I got into Krishnamurti, and one day I was at the Bodhi Tree bookstore in LA, and I saw the latest Krishnamurti book. It was called Brockwood Talks, and it was about, they had just started a new school in England, like a high school for teenagers. And Krishnamurti lived there for a lot of the year, and I thought, wow, there's nothing else I would rather do than go to that school. I wrote a handwritten letter to Krishnamurti. I remember putting it in the envelope, addressing it to the school, putting it in the mailbox, and just sort of doing this little silent prayer of something, please come true. I never thought he would respond. A few weeks later, I got a letter back from Krishnamurti. Yes, please come to our school in England. Be a student at our school. And I thought, wow, like a little teenager. I was still in high school, or I just finished high school. And so I went to be at the high school in England. I just finished high school in the States, and it was sort of weird to be going to a high school in England, but I wasn't going for the school. You know, I wanted to meet Krishnamurti. I wanted to see what the teachings looked like, and I wanted to see what it looked like for someone to be living it. I wanted to eat like Krishnamurti. I wanted to do yoga like Krishnamurti. I wanted to dress like Krishnamurti. You know, I wanted to meet other people that were into his philosophy. So I went to the school, and I had my first actual yoga lesson there with a man named Jim Fowler, who was a student of the Desigachar style. They didn't call it Vini Yoga at that point, but he was a student of Desigachar, and he was teaching Vini Yoga. I did privates with Jim every week. At the end of class, he would do a little line drawing squiggle of what we did in the class. And I've got a notebook full of all our little classes with little hand drawings of the little sequences. That's where I first learned how to do the hand drawings. I would vote, like, it's a good, fun thing to know how to do the little line drawings of yoga poses. When I do freeform, I usually have my notebook with me, and I'm just channeling my practice, and I just always quickly scribble down what I'm practicing. You come up with these cool little patterns that you couldn't make up on your own, and you know that they just flow nicely from one to the next. When I then teach, I'll take pieces of these patterns, and that becomes the content of my class. So I started doing yoga at the Krishnamurti school. It was a vegetarian school. There were 40 students, 40 teachers, living on a big mansion, and in a big mansion out on a big, it was sort of like living here, but in England, sort of between Winchester and Petersfield. It was a mansion that the Beatles almost bought at one point. It was like so cool being there. And Krishnamurti lived there, and we got to see him and talk with him, and you know, everyone that was there just felt like, wow, we're lucky. This is cool, and I definitely felt that. And learning yoga and eating vegetarian style with the people, it was a cool thing. So I was there as a student for 1 year. At the end of the year, I said to Krishnamurti, I'm really getting into this yoga, and I'd like to learn it more seriously. Who would you recommend that I study with? And he said, well, I would recommend that, see, he'd been studying with Iyengar for 20 years, private lessons, and then he got hurt and he switched to Desigachar, and he was doing private lessons with Desigachar. Iyengar was Desigachar's uncle, so there was a little bit of family tension when Krishnamurti switched teachers. Anyway, Krishnamurti suggested that I go study with Desigachar. So I wrote a letter, put it in the mailbox, crossed my fingers, made a little wish. Please, may I go to India? Never thought he'd write back. A few weeks later, I got a letter from Desigachar. Yeah, come to India and study yoga. So I was 20, tall, really skinny, white kid, 20, in India. You know, when you're 20, you're still a baby. You know what I mean? And everyone's looking up at me. Anyway, I went to India for a year and studied yoga. I lived at the Theosophical Society in Madras, and now it's called Chennai. And I would ride my bicycle over to Desigachar's house. I do lessons with him 3 times a week. That was sort of like the most I could do. Like, he didn't like to do more than that with anybody anyway, as far as I know. And as I would ride my bike over to their house, I would park the bike in the front yard and then go in. And always sitting on the porch was Desigachar's father. His father was Krishnamacharya. Are these names you know? Yes. Krishnamacharya was the teacher of Iyengar. Krishnamacharya was the teacher of Patabi Joyce, which became Ashtanga Yoga. Krishnamacharya was the teacher of his son Desyachar, which became Vinaya Yoga. Iyengar became Iyengar Yoga. And so this one teacher was significant. He wasn't just producing clones. He was like igniting passion in these people. Iyengar got it and started teaching his own thing. Patabi got it and started teaching his thing. Desyachar got it and it became his own thing. And so I would park my bike, walk into the house, see Krishnamacharya, I would salute him. You know, he was always sitting on the porch in a wicker chair, sitting like this. He was pretty old at that point, but he was beautiful. Like his skin was luminous, like the guy in the book. His head was shaved, but he had like a knot of hair at the back, you know how the Brahmins do. His 2 front teeth were missing, but otherwise he was beautiful. And I would salute him, you know, Namaste Guruji. And he never responded, and I thought it was so cool. You know what I mean? It's just like, wow, this guy is so cool. I heard him say 3 things. It's just sort of fun to know this. Like, this isn't great. And well, first thing he said to me was, please lock your bicycle. Second thing he said was, your teacher is not here today. And then the third thing he said to me was, or I overheard him say this. And he said it just like this: yoga is not mechanical. And I thought, wow, that's cool too. Yoga's not mechanical. And it just like stuck. You know, like 50 years later, I'm still remembering this. And so I would go over to their house and have private lessons with Desyachar. I was 20, he was 34. He's been very sick lately. I don't know if you've heard, but he's not doing too well. But so he was only 34. He was just a baby. You know, like 34. It's like, and already like this rising international teaching Krishnamurti yoga star. I would go into the room and be with Desyachar, private lessons, and he would start asking me things like, how do you like living in India? How do you like living near the beach? What do you think of the food? How is it riding your bike over here? You know, sort of like stuff, and I'm thinking, I came halfway around the world. My hour's nearly up. Are we going to do yoga anytime soon? It was sort of where I was coming from. And he just kept talking about this sort of what seemed to me silly stuff until I asked him a yoga question. And as soon as I asked him a yoga question, then he would respond. And then I got it. Oh, it's like, wow, being with him wasn't like being in school, where you go to school and they just cram you with the info and then you've got to regurgitate it. He wasn't like gonna like dish it out until I asked him. And then I thought, I got it. It's like, oh wow, okay. And I came up with hundreds of questions. And then it was like really interesting. Like, what do I want to know? What do I need to know? What am I interested in? And suddenly like learning became really fun. It wasn't like I was just learning a subject. It's like, yeah, what do I need to know? And it was fun for him and it's fun for me. And it's like, it was cool. When I then later studied with Iyengar, he was just the opposite. Just gushing with info and gushing with info. And I love that too. But so I was in India for a year with Desyachar. I was heading back to California. Can I just go on? Is this okay?
Yes.
So I was heading back to California. My thought was I was going to go to art school. I wanted to grow up and be a painter is what I thought. Hasn't happened yet. I don't think it will. But I wanted to go to art school. So I was heading back to California. But as I was heading back to California, I stopped in England at the Krishnamurti school just to say hi to the people. And they said, well, the teacher, that Jim, who's been teaching, he stopped teaching. He's not here anymore. We don't have a yoga teacher. You're fresh out of India. How would you like to be the yoga teacher? And I nearly fell over. It's like, are you kidding? Again, like there's nothing else I'd rather do, actually. And it just felt like this magic door opened. I slid through it, and it's like, I didn't have to force myself into the predicament. And suddenly I was the yoga teacher at the Krishnamurti school. I was 21 at that point. The students were, I had been a student, so that was a little weird. But it was also sort of cool because I knew what the kids were going through. So I was now a staff member at the school teaching high school age students yoga. And my training was to teach everybody privates. There were 40 students, 45 students by that time. And so I was doing 45 privates in a week. That's a lot of teaching. But it wasn't like an hour and a half class. It was like school. You know, like you do a period and then another period, and you go to physics, and then you go to chemistry, then you go to yoga, then you go to art. So people would sign up for yoga as one of their classes. It wasn't mandatory, but it was sort of like expected that the students would take yoga. They didn't have to do it, but it was sort of like, you should take yoga class. So I was teaching a lot of privates. It was good for me to get a lot of teaching practice. I taught there for 5 years. By the time I left and I went into the real world to teach a yoga class, it was so nice to be with adults who were wanting to be there, who weren't just like signing up for this easy class. You know, it's like a whole different thing. I rented a ballet studio and I started teaching, putting up flyers around town, and started teaching there. And somewhere in there, I met Iyengar. I was in England still for those 5 years. And the father of one of the students was an Iyengar teacher, a Frenchman, Jean-Bernard Ricci. Has anyone heard of him? J.B. Ricci? He was very creative. He lived in Paris. He was visiting the school. He wanted to see how I taught. And he could tell I was a newbie at this. I was just a kid, and he was like this wizard already, you know. And I did a private with him, and he put me in chairs and different things, and it's like, whoa, wow, this Iyengar yoga is cool. And so suddenly I started shifting away from the Desikachar yoga and getting interested in Iyengar yoga. I started studying with a woman in London named Mary Stewart. I would take the train into London. She let me stay at her house. I didn't even realize how lucky I was. You know, like she just took me in. She let me assist her classes. She fed me, you know what I mean? I never paid her. I didn't have any money. But I got all this like cool training with the Iyengar people. At some point I met Donna Holloman. I started going to Italy to study with her. And my personal practice finally took off when I was doing Iyengar yoga. I went to India and I studied with Iyengar for 6 months. And all up until that point, I was trying to practice at home, but I was having difficulty. Like I would go into the room and I would do it a little bit, but I'd always sort of conk out after a while. And it wasn't until I got into the Iyengar method that my personal practice really kicked in. And what it was for me was they were very specific about what you practice. On Monday, do this. On Tuesday, do this. On Wednesday, do this. They had the whole week mapped out. Now that gives me the creeps, personally. But at the time, it like really helped because like there was no confusion about what to do. Oh, someone that I trust has thought about it. They recommended it. And so I started doing it. No confusion, and I just did it, and I did it, and I did it, and I loved it. My practice kicked in, and I was disciplined, and I was doing it every day for hours, weeks, and I just was, finally my yoga was happening. And the disciplined, structured practice was key. I'm voting for disciplined, structured practice at a certain level. It's intelligent at a certain level. It helped me get into it. And I did it, 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 and I did it. And I loved it. And I did it, and I did it, and I did it. And I started loving it a little less. And I did it, and I did it, and I did it. And I was loving it a little less. But because it had worked so well for so long, I just kept doing it, and I kept doing it. But I found myself loving it less and less. And my enthusiasm for yoga just started going down the tubes. You know? Somewhere around then I met a man named Joel Kramer. There was an article in a yoga magazine by Joel. He was talking about how to make a line of energy and just the philosophy that he was into. And I thought, wow, this is the best article on yoga I've ever read. It was like the perfect mixture of Krishnamurti and yoga. And I thought, wow, I would love to meet this guy. So I wrote him a letter. Crossed my fingers, made a wish. And I said, hey, that's the best article I've ever read. I would love to meet you. You know, like suddenly it was like this beacon of hope. I would love to meet you. And he wrote back and said, well, I'd love to meet Krishnamurti. And I was still at the school. So I said, oh, that's easy. Just come to the school, I'll introduce you and blah, blah, blah. So he came to England. I introduced him to Krishnamurti. We all had lunch together. And then I went and did a private lesson with Joel. Within 5 minutes, he taught me how to make a line of energy and begin to like follow the energy. Within 5 minutes, my whole yoga world was just like turned inside out. I loved Iyengar yoga. I still love Iyengar yoga. I love the precision of it. The precision of it is what got my mind involved in a way that it hadn't been. But it started getting stale for me until I met Joel and I started running energy through the lines, and I realized that, wow, when I run energy through my arm line and I just look for the feeling of perfect flow, all the stuff that Iyengar was talking about started happening all by itself. And I wasn't having to make it happen. And then I realized, oh wow, that's what Iyengar's doing. This is how he's inspired and coming up with his teaching. He's running energy through the lines, and he's like looking for the feeling of perfect flow, and wherever it dings, he tells you about it. And he's in learning mode. And he was definitely in learning mode. It was fun to watch him. And so I got the gist of how to do yoga from Joel. My practice then started becoming intuitive. It had started to become that way prior to that, doing the Iyengar yoga, doing the poses. And the thing is, like, when you run energy through the lines and do it exactly the way people are telling you, at a certain point when you get into it, and I think I was even saying this morning a little bit, at a certain point the energy starts taking over. You've got to be brave enough to like let the energy take over. And for me, just before I met Joel, the energy was beginning to take over, but I didn't know that that's what you were supposed to do. The energy would start to move this way, and I go, no, you're supposed to be like this. And then it would move like, no. So it's like I was just sort of, no. So it was just stifling the flow. And then when I met Joel and he taught me to make the line of energy and all this stuff, it's like suddenly, oh yeah, that's what was happening. That's why I was getting frustrated. All the structured practice was working. But then it works. When it works, the structure begins to dissolve. And at that point, you've got to be brave enough to follow the new lines. And if someone had just said to me at that point, the structure, when it works, it's helpful along the way. But when it really begins to work, it will begin to dissolve. If someone had just said that, the structure will begin to dissolve and your practice will become intuitive. One sentence. You know what I mean? That would have saved me years of angst. And so now I don't like to structure my practice. Now I just let the energy guide me. But again, if you just say to somebody, just let the energy guide you, most people don't get it. They will get it. But it's too loose at first. And so if it's too loose, you've got to bring it down a level and tell people exactly what to do. You want to get to the place where your practice is intuitive, but if you go into the room and you're just really not flowing with it yet, then be willing to discipline yourself, structure the sequences the way your teachers have said, and just discipline yourself that way. And then the technique is get into it. And then when it starts wanting to veer and be differently, know that that's the cool thing to do. And let your practice start becoming intuitive. And again, you learn to do that in the poses, but really you learn to do that in your life. Okay, so that was sort of my story. I put up flyers around town, started teaching yoga. It's hard to make a living teaching yoga. And so I rigged it so I had very low overhead. I didn't have very many clothes. I had a crummy car. But I had a lot of free time. And I was really into having free time. I really didn't want to end up like my father. That was sort of like a big motivator for me. Dad had 4 kids and was sort of stuck in a job he didn't like. And I didn't want to get stuck in a job that I didn't like. He was very creative. He was a singer and actor, but it was just squelched. And it made him bitter. And you could see it. And I didn't want to be like that. Dad wrote me letters when I was in India. He said, why don't you just come home and get a job? And I was like, no. I've got the letter somewhere. He said, why don't you come home and learn how to make false teeth? And then the next letter is, you could learn upholstery.
I'm so glad you didn't do that.
Yeah, me too. And people would ask me, well, what sort of, and if you do teach yoga, people will ask you, what sort of style do you teach? And so my response, I would say this long story. I've studied with Desikachar people, Iyengar people, Joel Kramer, Dona, Vonda Scaravelli. Like, I was lucky to meet a bunch of cool people. And it's just sort of a mixture of all of this. And then finally somebody said to me, well, why don't you just call it freedom style? And I thought, hey, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. It's short. It's accurate. It's not limiting. It's not like Schiffmann style. You know what I mean? Iyengar never even called his thing Iyengar yoga. It's like other people called it Iyengar yoga. He was clear to say he's a student of yoga and he's learning yoga. And he was in learning mode and teaching what kept interesting him. So now I just call it freedom yoga. And I love being able to say that. In easy words, it's about listening for the download from big mind, your mind, the one and only mind. Thinking less, listening more, and then giving expression to what you find yourself knowing. Do it in the easy context of poses, do it in the easy context of learning to sit, and then learn to live your life like that. And if I'm doing that in a class, it's going to come out looking like one thing. If Carrie's doing the same thing, it's going to come out through her looking like something else. If Chris is doing it, it's going to come out through him differently. The technique is the same, like listen for guidance. That's the technique. And again, it's so cool. It's telling someone what to do without telling them what to do. It's not like you've got to always do it in this sequence, you've always got to do this counter pose. Yeah, that's good for a long time. But when it really begins to work, it'll begin to dissolve and you'll start flowering as intuitive practice. So I just know that all the structured practice will flower as intuitive. And so I'm still into the precision of Iyengar yoga, but now the precision is intuitive. And I don't like to talk about it too much because it's like, it's so slow to try and verbalize the nonverbal. And anything you say is just so like not it. You know, it's like it's hard to put words on a nonverbal experience. But the precision is like there. When I'm doing it, it doesn't look like Iyengar, but it's like I'm in there feeling it, adjusting it, letting it be intuitive. Sometimes strong, sometimes soft. And again, it's fun. So freedom yoga, listening for guidance, and then letting it gush through you. Integral to this is like really learning how to practice on your own. Most people have difficulty practicing on their own. I had difficulty practicing on my own. Invite friends over to your house and practice together. Just do freeform together. It's fun. It'll help you do it. And again, I would vote that when you practice, have your notebook and a pen. Don't dictate yourself too much. And then just get into the flow and watch what you do and take notes. So it'll feel like when I practice, it feels like I'm in class with the infinite and I'm down here taking notes. It's fun. And if you get a good insight about something, take the time to write it down. At first, I wouldn't let myself write down cool insights because, quote, I'm losing my heat. People told me, don't do that, you're going to lose your heat, you're going to break the flow. No, that's just the flow is like to write this down right now. It's like I'm catching this jewel. This is what I want. I want the clarity, like catch it while it's coming down clearly. If I don't write down a cool insight and I try and write it down later, I'm nowhere near the succinct clarity that it was. You want succinct clarity, not muddled, close rendition of what was succinct clarity. And when you meditate, I would vote, again, do what you want, but I usually have a little tape recorder with me. And if I start channeling good guidance, I just pick up the tape recorder and I talk into it. And it feels like I'm just sort of talking to myself, but when I listen to it later, it's like, oh wow, I was getting instructions from Big Mind. I'm really glad I wrote that, I caught that. Because you listen to it later and it's like, oh wow, these are the spiritual teachings that I need. Better than I'm finding in books. More specific to my need. You know, and then again, your personal practice starts getting fun. You're not just doing what someone else told you to do all the time, which is helpful to get you going. But, you know, people that are really the artists with this, they're in there having fun and learning. It feels like you're creating just as you practice and as you take notes.